Hello, everybody. Welcome to the news desk. That was a fascinating look at some new cards, but that's then being January 16th. Right now, we have to deal with Team Unified Standard. We need a lesson, Professor. So please, please take us through what Team Unified Standard is. The basics are that it's 225 cards that are all a standard legal deck, but what does that mean in terms of how you build it?
Essentially. So Team Unified Standard is the format that we're going to play for the next 4 rounds. The rules of Team Unified Standard constructed are that, well, each team has to build 3 standard legal decks, then assign them to player A, B, and C, and then each round one country is paired against another. Player A of one country plays against player A of the other country, and so on. And the country who wins at least 2 of those matches wins the round. Right. But yeah, there's a catch. Across all 3 decks and sideboards combined, there can only be 4 copies of any standard legal card, except for basic lands. So a good way to imagine this is that you just have one giant trade folder with one play set of standard and, well, a big pile of basic lands, and you have to build 3 decks from those.
So like if we were all getting in a car to drive to a pre-TQ, and yeah, we just have our play set and we have to build 3 decks. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you can just show up with, say, 3 Abzan decks. You have to split up the cards.
Right. We only have
somehow.
the 4 Siege Rhinos.
Yeah.
Okay.
But there are other very important cards in Team Unified.
How tricky could that be?
It is quite a puzzle. It is an exciting puzzle, but also a fairly complicated one. So I'm really curious to see how the teams are gonna solve it. But when it comes to this current standard, yeah, by far the most important cards are the fetch lands. Yep. So many decks in standard rely on these fetch lands, especially in combination with the battle lands. They allow you to put powerful gold cards in your deck. They fuel delve. They lead to consistent mana bases, so that even 2-color standard decks often play as many as 12 fetch lands. But, well, 12 times 3, that's 36. You only have access to 20, so that doesn't add up. There are not enough fetch lands to go around. So that leads to a challenge.
And what does that challenge look like? I mean, how do you determine which fetch lands want to be in which seed?
Well, the key is to avoid overlap somehow, so to pick different decks that don't need the same lands. For instance, if you look at Jeskai or Esper, well, they both play Floodstrand because they can get both blue and white mana. But even in Abzan, this card is played because it can fetch both Canopy Vista, the green-white jewel, and Sunken Hollow, the blue-black jewel, so fixing all 3 colors of mana. It will be difficult to play those kinds of decks together unless you make drastic changes to the mana base.
Well, aside from the fetch lands, what are the key overlap cards?
Yeah, there are a bunch of other ones. Besides the fetch lands, for instance, Shambling Vent is a card that you see in many black and white decks. So if you want to play, say, Abzan and Esper together, you may have to fight over this land as well. I mean, if you have to split them 2 and 2 or 3 and 1 across 2 decks, it's not the end of the world, but it may still weaken both decks a little bit. Hangerback Walker, a very powerful 2-drop for standard. It's an artifact, so it can go to pretty much any deck, which of course is an issue for Team Unified. There are some replacement 2-drops that you can play, but once again, Hangerback Walker could lead to some incompatibilities between decks. Gideon, another example, one of the best things that you can do on turn 4 in the format. But perhaps even the most important card on the slide is Jace. Still one of the best cards in standard, and there's just no replacement that does the same thing as Jace, that offers the same card selection, the same card advantage later on. So I think you can only play one Jace deck in the format, for instance.
Do you see anything where you would ever want to split your Jaces? Is that crazy talk? You could say it's crazy talk.
It's close to crazy talk. The card is so essential to a number of archetypes that without the full 4 copies of Jace, I would prefer to just play another deck.
Please tell me you made a graph for us, Frank.
Yes, well, there you have it. Here I combined all these key overlap cards, and sure, there are some more like Fiery Impulse, Duress, and so on, but have to cut it off at some point, and combine it with the most popular archetypes in Standard right now, at least when based on recent popularity in big events. So for all of those archetypes, I try to mark which of these key overlap cards they need. And there are already some choices being made here. A lot depends on which version of a deck you're talking about, or some judgment calls on which cards are essential. For instance, I didn't mark Hangerback Walker for Abzan because they often play Heir of the Wilds anyway. I looked at the Hangerback Walker version of Esper Tokens rather than the Jace version. Didn't mark Windswept Heat for Atarka Red because they only play typically 2 copies. So we can argue a little bit whether or not there should be an X in a certain cell or not. You can also argue on whether some of the replacements that are listed below the table are perfect or not. Many of these decks use similar sets of cards, but this is, I guess, as close as I could get to putting the heart of the Unified Standard puzzle onto a single table, and a puzzle it is.
So Frank, if I'm reading this graph correctly, the basic idea is a team would want to choose 3 of these columns, which correspond to decks, and make sure that no row has more than 1 X in those columns, if that sort of makes sense?
Yes, exactly. Then you avoid all the overlap. And if you have overlap in maybe 1 card, you can probably manage that to some extent. If you have more, then you will run into a lot of trouble.
So it's more minimizing overlap as much as possible, if you can.
Exactly.
Great.
So there's a column in there that particularly stands out for its lack of X's.
Yeah, the Eldrazi Ram deck in particular doesn't really need much. Sure, Hangerback Walker is marked. It's a nice roadblock, early roadblock for the deck that later on you can play for 8 mana and then trigger Sanctum of Ugin. But yeah, it does not need any fetch lands, and that is a potential key to solving this format.
Okay, so let's take a look at what a potential lineup without overlap would look like.
Sure. So indeed, I enumerated all of the possible 3-deck combinations from that table and found these combinations which have overlap in at most 1 key card. So if you want to play, say, stock versions of popular standard archetypes in Team Unified Standard, then these are your main options. So this essentially lays down the gauntlet. Already, yeah, you see a lot of Eldrazi Ram decks. You see a lot of rows with Atarka Red, which also doesn't take many cards away from the other decks. So this will already be an indication that the metagame in Team Unified Standard is likely going to differ quite a bit from the metagame at your regular standard events. But we'll get into the metagame implications of that
Sure.
at some point later.
So Frank, one thing that stands out to me is a lot of these combinations have 2 or 3 decks that are very polarized in terms of strategy, very extreme strategies, like Eldrazi Ramp, obviously. You're not playing a lot of early game, you're going up to big cards, whereas Atarka Red is as fast as possible almost. And then Esper Dragons represents more of a blue-based control deck. Do you think that when players are choosing their decks or even building their decks, they're thinking about how can my decks have 75 card configurations, including sideboard, that match up well against these extreme strategies? Does that sort of make sense?
Yes, for sure. Because everyone knows about this as well. Everyone is going to prepare against this and have their sideboards lined up for it. Now, it can be a bit difficult to find good cards that are great against, say, both Eldrazi Ramp and Atarka Red, because as you mentioned, these are such polar opposites. So cards that are good against Atarka Red, like Everything Cleric, Surge of Righteousness, cheap removal, life gain. Yeah, that doesn't really do anything against Eldrazi Ramp, for instance. Well, there we have the deck. So on the top of the previous table, you saw the combination of Eldrazi Ramp plus Atarka Red plus Esper Dragons, which I would put as the basic deck to beat, the configuration to beat. So let's just go over these decks real quick to introduce the viewers who may not be completely familiar with the format. Now let's stick with the Eldrazi Ram deck. What this deck is trying to do is to use cards like Nissa's Pilgrimage to go up to high land counts early, so that you can play Haymakers like Ugin or Ulamog as early as turn 5. One card in particular that I want to point out here is Void Winnower. Now in regular standard, this might just be like a one-off in the sideboard, but if you expect a lot of teams here to show up with an Eldrazi Ram deck in the lineup, you will face lots of mirror matches. Well, this card is incredible in the ramp mirror match.
If we're in the ramp mirror match, you have a void winner or play. What's the best card I can play to answer that?
Yeah, well, you can't play Ugin anymore. You can play Ulamog. Maybe the best card that you can play is your own void winner. So yeah, that may lead to some crazy games. Yeah.
And I've heard some rumors this weekend that Void Winnower is a card that a lot of teams are looking for. That's kind of been scarce on site here, so we might see it show up. It's pretty exciting.
So the second deck in the configuration to beat is Atarka Red. It's your red aggro deck of the format. Lots of cheap early creatures, some tokens, and then in the late game, when you have already put down your opponent to a somewhat low life total, you can close it out with some pump spells. In particular, the combo of Temur Battle Rage and Become Immense is quite potent.
And this is a deck we've seen win, in some form or another, multiple Pro Tours over the last year.
Indeed. Indeed, one form or another. There are other versions of red aggro decks, like a more landfall-oriented list or some others. I like this one because it has Dragon Fodder and Wild Slash. Wild Slash in particular, great card for the mirror match to, prevent a Become Immense from the opponent.
And if you see a card like Become Immense, that means that this is a deck that's going to want fetch lands?
Yes.
Right, you can't not play this deck with fetch lands if you're going to play Become Immense.
Yes, not only because you want to fuel Delve, but also for having a consistent access to green mana. This deck does need, say, 8 fetch lands at least, preferably a bit more. Yeah.
Sure.
So the third deck in the configuration to beat that I put up is Esper Dragons. It's your control deck. Some counter magic, some spot removal, just says no early on, and then eventually it will take some card advantage from Dig Through Time or Dragonlord Ojitai to win the game. Now there are various other decks based around Jace or Flutterstrand that I could put into this third spot. For instance, the 4-color Rally deck. But I put in Esper Dragons for several reasons. It has been putting up good results as of late. It will be difficult to play a 4-color Crackling Doom in this format, so hard to find a good matchup against it.
The interesting thing to me about that configuration, though, is both Esper Dragons and Eldrazi Ramp seem like decks that Atarka Red is happy to see.
I think the matchup of Atarka Red versus Esper Dragons is overrated, actually.
Okay.
Especially if you get a good version of Esper Dragons with the right sideboard cards and a good
version that
pilot.
knows it's going to see a red deck every round?
Yes. Then this matchup is much closer and could even be advantageous for the Esper Dragons deck.
Okay.
But yes, the red aggro deck is absolutely the worst matchup for the Eldrazi Ramp deck.
Okay.
So if we go back to the overview sheet with all the key possibilities, yeah, all of them include Eldrazi Ramp, and this is indeed what you get if you want to stick to stock lists of popular standard archetypes. But I don't think that this Eldrazi Ramp deck will be well positioned for this event. Well, one reason was the poor matchup against Atarka Red, which is likely going to be popular. The other reason is that, well, everyone knows this. Everyone has done this analysis, so everyone's going to be ready for the Eldrazi Ramp deck with cards like Disdainful Stroke, Infinite Obliteration, other Disruption. Yeah.
A pretty exciting card for people to be bringing to a Magic.
Take out all your Ulamogs, and then what are you going to do?
So what do we do?
Well, I think a key to get an edge in this format is to avoid playing this Eldrazi Ramp deck, which means going to other possible lists. There are some options. I have 2 in particular that I think would be good, and that also many teams here have come up with. Because, in fact, I already looked through some of the lists. Eldrazi Ramp is actually not the most popular archetype here in Team Unified Standard.
Okay.
Many teams have indeed been trying to avoid the deck in one way or another. Now, one way to do that is, well, to go for a different deck that needs no fetch lands at all. Mono Red is a deck that has been around. It's maybe a little underpowered compared to Atarka Red, but if you don't need Wooded Foothills or a Bloodstained Mire and just go for perhaps more of a mid-range strategy, sometimes with Thunderbreak regions, then you can play such a deck next to, say, Ebzan and Esper Dragons. All the fetch lands line out that way, and you don't have to play the Eldrazi Ramp deck.
So you get to offload 8 fetch lands from the Atarka Red deck into your other 2 decks.
Yes, pretty much. Now, not a lot of teams have gone for this route. By far, the most popular approach is to go for, well, a different mana base. Because, well, as I said, many of the decks in Standard play lots of fetch lands, but there are plenty of other non-basic lands around that are indeed put in, of course, to give us some options. For instance, there are plenty of Abzan decks built around either maybe a more tap land mana base with the tri lands, or maybe a pain land mana base with the pain lands. If you play such an Abzan list with few fetch lands, you can put that next to, say, Atarka Red and Esper Dragons. A perfect possibility as well. Also, a bunch of other teams have gone for white-black decks. Typically a token kind of list.
That sounds interesting.
Yeah, because it doesn't really need fetch lands to work, so you can put that next to, say, 4-color Rally and Atarka Red. Another great option. And there were also a bunch of teams who looked at, okay, well, we really want to play Atarka Red because it's just a great deck. We also love, for instance, our Esper Dragons deck. So if we look at the fetch lands that are remaining, okay, we have Windswept Heat. What can we do with that? And then they were like, well, Abzan with Windswept Heat, it's an option, but meh, Windswept Heat only fixes two colors of mana for the deck. How about Temur? Windswept Heat actually fixes 3 colors of mana for the deck. You can play some tap lands. So we just play with Savage Knuckleblade and co. Especially with the version tuned towards Atarka Red, Esper Dragons,
Sure.
Eldrazi Ramp. You can really focus on those decks because the metagame is different.
Do we see a card like Beastcaller Savant there or something like that? That's
I'm not sure that card is in those Temur lists.
okay. We've seen it in Temur lists in Standard before.
But it may be in some versions
Sure.
of it, perhaps that are also seeing play here. It is going to be great to see some of the offbeat decks arise to find out.
Put you on the spot right now. You have to go out. You get tagged in for Team Netherlands to put your 3 decks out there. What are your 3 decks for Team Netherlands if you're running the show?
I would probably like to play 4-color Rally because many teams have told me that it has a good matchup against Atarka Red and against Eldrazi Ramp, 2 of the decks that you might expect a lot. So together with that, maybe you can play some Abzan deck, maybe an Abzan mid-range deck with a bunch of tap lands, plus, well, Atarka Red, which is still fine. I would try to avoid Eldrazi Ramp, and that would be a solution I would like for those reasons.
Okay. Well, there you have it. There's your look at Team Unified Standard and what the teams out there on the floor who are getting ready to play right now have been facing, preparing for this tournament here at the World Magic Cup.